Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Very excited about today's episode. I've only done a few like it. This episode is about missing time. It does include several accounts of humanoids as well. I call this one Time Stood Still. 11 extraordinary UFO and alien encounters with missing time. Missing time and amnesia is very commonly reported, especially with very close encounters, and yet it remains poorly understood. Is it the ETs doing this? Do we bear some responsibility? Hard to say for sure. There's differing opinions on this, but hopefully these cases that I'm presenting to you today will help bring some clarity to this question. So I've got 11 cases for you today. Some are very early, some are quite recent. They come from all over the world, including Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Finland, Spain, and 6 from the United States, including Illinois, Maryland, New York, Utah, Washington, D.C., and 1 from an undisclosed location within the United States. Again, cases of missing time have a lot to teach us. The cases I've chosen for you today have some really unique elements, and of course, multiple witnesses, various forms of evidence such as electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, physiological effects, and one case actually involving photographic evidence, which is quite unusual. So let's just get started. First case I want to talk about today, I call It Was Like Time Stood Still. This one occurred way back in 1929, in the summer of 1929, in the very rural area of Spring Valley, New York. And this case has some really interesting elements to it. This case comes from researcher Bud Hopkins, the author of at least 4 books, including one called Missing Time. He wrote about this case in an article called Probable Childhood Abduction. This was published in the MUFON Journal. This case does rest on the testimony of a single witness, an anonymous woman, whom Bud called Ellen Sutter. It took place in a rural Spring Valley, New York, now a heavily populated suburban area with some 33,000 people, but back in 1929, at the time of Ellen's encounter, it had less than 4,000 residents. It was one overcast summer afternoon when Ellen, then about 9 years old, was playing outside her family's home. Suddenly she saw a bright flash of light in the sky, and as Ellen says, it was like the reflection of the sun on a metallic object. It kind of blinded me, and I was startled and I looked up. There was a big oak tree outside our property, and above the tree was something huge, shaped like a dirigible, with many, many portholes and this peculiar light. Now, she didn't notice that the portholes had an unusual shape that she found difficult to describe, but she does recall that the craft was metallic, and Ellen now experienced a sense of strange loneliness and eerie silence, what researchers call the Oz effect. As Ellen said, there wasn't another soul, not another noise. It was like time stood still, almost as if you were in the present, and yet you weren't. I can't describe it. It was like the fields were there, the tree was there, the house was there, I was there. My mother was in the house, but she wasn't in the same world I was in. It was like I was rooted to the spot. The next thing she knew, humanoids emerged from the craft and started to float down towards her. As Ellen says, all of a sudden, these peculiar things, a few, I don't recall how many, came out of it and seemed to be floating. This is why I never told anyone, because as I said, it sounds a dream. These people, I call them people, I don't know what they were. They looked like a diving suit with a head shape at the top and a very distorted, short-looking body. It was weird, very, very weird. At the time I kept thinking, my gosh, they're on ropes or something. You know, the way a child thinks. These people came out of an opening below the window section through something like a trap door. They just seemed to walk around like you and I would, up in the air. Now, per Ellen, these beings were gray, blue in color. They floated or walked in the air about 30 or 40 feet off the ground, she estimates, but she has no memory of them coming any closer. But she does remember them leaving. As she said, they eventually got back into the thing, and it went off, like you'd snap your fingers once or twice and it was gone. No smoke, no noise, and I thought, oh, I'm losing my mind. It's a dream. And yet, over the years, it's something that's always been with me. Many times the memory of it has come back to me. Now when Bud Hopkins asked her how long she viewed the UFO and the beings, Ellen was unable to say. As she says, I have no idea. I do remember at the time that my mother scolded me for having been gone so long, saying, where have you been? What have you been doing? Things like that. So this does sound like missing time. And another curious feature, but one which often turns up in missing time cases, is that Ellen told nobody about what happened. As she says, I thought no one would believe me. And I also felt that it was something I couldn't reveal at the time. It was almost like a secret that I should keep. Now, although Ellen cannot say for sure she had missing time, Bud does believe that she probably did. As Bud Hopkins says, the presence of a time lapse is strongly implied, as is the suggestion of an unconscious injunction not to tell anyone about her experience. And in further confirmation of missing time and a probable onboard encounter is Ellen's post-encounter reactions. As she says, I was afraid for quite a while afterwards, very much afraid, for weeks afterwards. I was afraid of being alone, of it happening again. I wanted to have a feeling of safety all the time. I didn't feel safe. Ellen also suddenly developed a phobia of becoming ill or going to the doctor or getting sick from having seen the strange beings, this despite the fact that she never remembered them coming any closer than 100 feet to her. And a third reaction was dreaming about the encounter. As Ellen says, yes, I had dreams about it, many times, more or less being chased by these things, whatever they were. Sometimes they were on the ground, and sometimes flying. It puzzled me and upset me, and I'm not the kind of person who dreams very much. So after interviewing her, Bud Hopkins asked if she would consider hypnosis, but she declined. She was afraid of it. But she was both shocked and relieved to hear that many others had described this kind of encounter. Ellen herself makes no judgments about what happened and called it only, quote, a strange, peculiar experience. But after interviewing her at length, Bud Hopkins is convinced that she is telling the truth as she remembers it. As he says, I have absolute confidence in the veracity of Mrs. Sutter and respect for the clarity of her recall. The most interesting aspect of this classic apparent abduction is its date. It occurred most probably in 1929. Yeah, as Bud Hopkins says, I think the most interesting aspect of this case is that it occurred so early, 1929, well before the modern age of UFOs, well before there were any reported onboard UFO encounters or really accounts of grays. And that does appear to be what this witness is describing. And given that she had this phobia of getting sick and going to the doctor and had all kinds of fears going on following her encounter, I do suspect she was probably taken on board. I suspect that's the case with the vast majority of incidents involving missing time, because when people go under hypnosis, that's certainly what they almost always discover. So yeah, an important case by any means. Now let's move to the next case, which I call Stop All Atomic Tests. This occurred on April 24, 1959 in the coastal town of Piata, Brazil. This is an amazing case. The witness is very credible, and he was able to obtain photographic evidence, which, as I mentioned earlier, is quite rare. This case was fairly widely published in newspapers and in several UFO magazines, such as the APRO Bulletin, the SBEDV Bulletin, Flying Saucer Review, and more. The witness is Helio Aguiar, a 32-year-old store clerk. On April 24, 1959, Helio borrowed a motorcycle which belonged to his friend, Captain Leibovich. He picked it up at the headquarters of the 6th Military Region where Captain Leibovich worked, and then went to visit his nephews. Afterwards, Helio was riding his motorcycle along Avenida Octavio Mangabeira in Piatra, Brazil, which borders the ocean. As he drove, he noticed a speck of an object over the ocean, just a dark speck. Now he wears glasses, and at first he assumed it must be something on his glasses. But soon this dark speck grew larger, and it appeared to be moving closer, and soon he could now see that it was actually a flattish, disc-shaped craft. Without warning, Helio's motorcycle now failed, and he came to a stop. And the weird craft was now close enough that he could see it was silver metallic. It had a dome on top, what appeared to be portholes, a flat bottom with 4 half-spheres protruding from it, and what looked to him almost like weird symbols on the bottom. The craft proceeded to perform a variety of maneuvers, doing loops, flipping upside down, hovering at a 45-degree angle, and more. Now Helio had his camera ready, so he quickly got it out and snapped a series of photographs. And as he was taking the 3rd photograph, he says he began to feel a weird pressure in his head, while at the same time he felt an urge to write something down, almost as though he was being ordered to do so. He felt like he was being hypnotized. He continued to try and take a 4th photograph, but instead he found himself losing consciousness. Some time passed, he's not sure how long, but the next thing he knew, he was waking up, draped over his motorcycle. He now saw that he had a pencil in his right hand, and in his left hand he was holding a piece of paper that had previously been in his pocket, which he had used to play tic-tac-toe with his nephews. But now, on the flip side of the paper, he saw a note written in his own handwriting in his native language of Portuguese, which he had no memory of writing. And the note read, and I quote, "Atomic experiences for warfare should cease definitely. The balance of the universe is at stake. We are watching and ready to interfere." Now this statement has been variously translated in some of the publications. Another version is, "Put an absolute stop to all atomic tests for warlike purposes. The balance of the universe is threatened. We shall remain vigilant and ready to intervene." And a third and final translation, "Atomic experiments for warlike purposes shall be definitely stopped. The equilibrium of the universe is threatened. We will remain vigilant and ready to interfere." So all 3 messages, while slightly paraphrased, have the same essential meaning. Very much impressed by his encounter, but at the same time still in doubt and wondering if he had imagined the whole thing, Helio went directly to military headquarters to see his friend, Captain Leibovich. There they developed the photographs he had taken, and to their amazement, the 3 photographs Helio had taken showed the flying saucer he had seen. And there was also a 4th photograph which showed the flying saucer off in the distance, apparently leaving. This was a photograph that Helio himself didn't even remember taking. Naturally, these photographs were subjected to a thorough analysis. Analysis showed that the angle of the sun and the shadows aligned with the time and location where these photographs were taken. There was no evidence of any strings or hoaxing of any kind. The military also did an investigation into Helio himself and his past, which showed that he was a man of honesty and integrity. And in fact, Helio was offered money for his photographs, which he steadfastly refused. The note Helio had written was also subjected to handwriting analysis, and it was shown to be his writing, although according to the analysts, it looked as though it was written under some emotional stress. Now, it was revealed that Helio did have a prior interest and research into hypnosis, telepathy, and other psychic subjects. Now, interestingly, the country of Brazil had just obtained its first nuclear research reactor just 2 years earlier in 1957 and was moving forward quickly with its nuclear program when Helio had his encounter. Such an astonishing case. Yes, it is a single witness case, but we do have those photographs which were studied in depth and apparently have found to be genuine. And he is a very credible witness. What's most interesting to me about that case is the message he received, presumably from the ETs, about the dangers of nuclear weaponry, because that is the single most common message contactees will get. Yeah, don't be afraid, no harm will come to you. We hear this message over and over again, given to people all over the world. I think people who are at the lowest levels of society, so to speak, to people who are in very high positions. It's interesting, this gentleman did have access to a gentleman who was pretty highly placed within the Brazilian military, so perhaps that's why he was chosen. Hard to say for sure, but definitely a credible witness. Now let's move to the next case, which is really quite poignant. I call this one, Instead of Fright, There Was Sadness. This occurred in December of 1967 in an undisclosed location in the United States. All we know is that it was a very rural area. This is a multiple witness case and a really interesting example of missing time. This case comes from pioneering UFO researchers Coral and Jim Lorenzen and was published in the September 1976 issue of the APRO Bulletin. The witnesses are two young men who insisted upon complete anonymity. So I'll just call the primary witness Brent. He was 17 years old. It was one clear moonlit evening in December 1967 that Brent and his friend were driving their car, playfully chasing their other friends who were in a separate car through a rural area. As the hour approached midnight, Brent and his friend realized that they were getting low on gas and were about an hour away from home, so they decided to stop playing around and take a shortcut down a gravel road and get home. Now the road they were on turned out to be a dead end, and they were racing their car pretty fast, about 80 to 90 miles per hour, when they saw this dead end. So they tried to slow down to about 40 miles per hour, but were unable to stop in time, and they ended up hitting a ditch and damaging the radiator to the point where the car could not be operated. Thankfully, neither was injured, so they decided to just continue walking in the hopes of finding a telephone to call their parents and let them know they were fine, and that they needed a ride home. They could see a home about 3/4 of a mile away, and upon reaching it, they knocked on the front door, but nobody answered. They saw another home a half-mile beyond where they had left their car, so they turned around, headed in the other direction towards it, and it was then that one of them saw a strange orange light in the north sky and pointed it out to the other one. So as they walked to the other house, this orange light seemed to move closer, and by the time they reached the second house, the orange light had moved close enough to reveal a distinct saucer shape. So the boys started talking about whether they were imagining this, but they just approached the house and knocked on the front door. The dogs at the property barked at them, but again, nobody came to their aid, so forgetting momentarily about the saucer-shaped light, they began to walk to a third house located a half-mile away from this one. And as they started walking, they saw this object again, which now appeared to be coming closer to them and actually following them. Now this encouraged them to walk faster, and by the time they were halfway to the third house, they could see that this saucer was definitely following them and was now only a few hundred yards behind them. So this got them very afraid, and they began running as fast as they could. And as Brent says, "We were both frightened, nearly out of our minds. We were both at a dead run. But suddenly, and you must understand that at the time, it seemed that we went from the dead run and fright to standing still and looking at the saucer at least 2 or 3 miles away, leaving all this with no transition time. And instead of fright, there was a definite sadness that the saucer was leaving. And looking back to the second house, the lights were on, and the dogs, which had been quiet before we knocked at the door, were barking." So Brent and his friend were absolutely shocked. One moment they had been running in sheer terror from this object that was coming towards them. The next moment they were sad, and the object was going away. Now, seeing that the lights were on in the house they had just visited, they returned there, only to discover that it was now 4 a.m. They were very surprised at this, as it had been midnight when they started walking, and they had gone no more than 2.5 miles without stopping. As Brent says, this would leave a 2-hour gap in our lives which would account for our obvious turnaround feelings towards the saucer. We didn't try to tell anyone about the saucer, and in a way, that in itself is strange, because we didn't even consider it. Now, Coral and Jim Lorenzen continued to investigate this case, and they hope to provide a follow-up of the case in a future issue of the APRO Bulletin. Alas, that never happened, and as in most cases of missing time, what happened during the lost hours remains a mystery. My heart goes out to those two boys. It was clearly a very frightening experience for them. I wonder about it. Was this a case of an opportunistic onboard encounter? Did the ETs know that the boys would be out late at night? There's no real way to tell for sure. I sure do wonder if there was ever any follow-up on this case. If there was, it was never reported. But how amazing is the emotional reaction. Here we have two boys who are pretty much in a state of complete panic, and as if a switch is flipped, suddenly they are feeling this profound sadness. I have heard this before, and I think it's a really interesting indication of something going on here that we simply do not know. In other words, these boys don't remember the whole encounter. It's a really good example of missing time, and sure would be interesting to find out what the whole experience was. I think the vast majority of cases of missing time go unexplored, and probably the vast majority of them go unreported, because people can have missing time and not even know it. So let's look at another example. I call this next case the vanishing boy. This occurred in February of 1969 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. What's amazing about this case is that this boy apparently was taken in full view of two members of his family. It's a very unusual case. This alarming and very unusual case was published in La Crónica newspaper, and it occurred in February of 1969. The witnesses are a family of European immigrants who at the time were living as housekeepers for a building on Calle Pico in downtown Buenos Aires, Argentina. The main witness, Ruben Walter Rusin, was the 11-year-old grandson, and he was getting ready to go downstairs and join his aunt and grandmother on a brief shopping trip. And they were all together in the hallway when suddenly the aunt, Ana de Rasca, and the grandmother, Susana Las, were shocked to see Ruben becoming enveloped in this weird dark cloud. As it slowly and completely enveloped Ruben, the boy disappeared and the cloud slowly dissipated. Ruben was nowhere to be found. Immediately the aunt and grandmother frantically searched the house, but they could not find Ruben anywhere. They quickly alerted everybody, and soon the entire district was informed, and for the next 2.5 hours, the building was searched from top to bottom. The surrounding area was searched, but there was no trace of 11-year-old Ruben anywhere, nor had anybody reported seeing him. Then, 2.5 hours later, Ruben spontaneously reappeared in the corridor exactly where he had been enveloped by the dark cloud and taken. No one saw him reappear. He was just there. He was lying on the floor beside the refrigerator. His skin was unnaturally warm, and on each cheek of his face there was a strange pale red circle. Now Ruben himself was unable to explain what had happened to him, but he did have some memories. He said that he suddenly became disoriented and found himself unable to move, and then he suddenly found himself lying on something that he described as soft and warm, kind of like a mattress, and he had the impression that he was inside a sphere. He saw bright lights around him. He sensed the presence of somebody standing near him, touching him with hot hands and saying, "Habla, habla," or "talk, talk." Weirdly, the words were pronounced with an incorrect accent, he said. Next, Ruben felt some sort of earpiece being inserted into his ear, and finally he heard the voice of his grandmother calling him, and he woke up, finding himself on the floor in their apartment. And he was unable to remember anything else. Per the family, Ruben was a highly intelligent, normal and bright kid, and was in fact at the top of his class in school. I can't say I've heard of another case quite like that. There are a number of cases of observed abductions. I did a whole episode on that called Caught in the Act. You can check that out. And if I had known about this case, I would have included it in that episode because it does look like this young boy was in fact taken on board. Although they didn't see a UFO from the outside, he's describing your typical onboard encounter where he's laid out on a table and apparently physically examined. Also some interesting physiological effects associated with this encounter. It's just a really unusual case. All right, let's move to the next one. I call this one 22 Missing Hours. This occurred on August 21st, 1975 in the large city of Benidorm, Spain. This is a pretty crowded area. What's amazing about this case is that this gentleman was missing for almost a full day. This case is also very unusual. It was first published in the November 24, 1979 issue of the Spanish newspaper Sutter. I haven't seen it anywhere else. The main witness is Jose Abad Avalos. He was a jeweler from the city of Benidorm, located in the Alicante province of Spain. And it was around 11 p.m. on August 20, 1975, that Jose and his friends, all huge opera fans, were enjoying one of their routine weekly get-togethers to talk about music. It was now around 2 a.m., now August 21st, that Jose and his friend, a very famous journalist by the name of Edelmiro Trio, were walking to Edelmiro's apartment to enjoy some sandwiches and coffee. After that, they took a walk to the beach, and about 4:15 a.m., Jose left his friend's apartment and began the walk to his own home, which were the apartments at the Pielinen Fiesta building. It was now 4:30 a.m., and as he was walking home, he was shocked to see a strange light in the sky, which was both ascending and then descending at a dizzying speed. He first wondered if it might be a helicopter or perhaps a small plane in distress, but he didn't think too much about it. He just continued walking along the Tomás Ortuna Avenue, and when he reached the Alicante-Valencia General Highway, he noticed a, quote, frightening darkness, which he said seemed to almost descend over the city. So this concerned him, and he picked up his pace, and as he was crossing a small bridge, this is when he saw an enormous, brilliant light in front of him. Now we later learned that around the same time he was seeing this brilliant, unexplained light, another group of people in a touring car were apparently blinded by an unexplained brilliant light, which caused them to have an accident. Their car plunged into the sea. This was just a short distance away. Reportedly, one of the occupants of the car drowned in the accident. So this may or may not be connected. At any rate, now arriving home at his apartment at the Pielinen Fiesta building, he found his wife waiting for him, and she was incredibly worried and asked him where he had been all this time. And he explained that after he had been at work, he went to go meet his friends, as he normally did. So she seemed dubious, but he just went to sleep, and the next day, or what he thought was the next day, he arrived at his jewelry shop. This was around 10 a.m., and the clerk who works for him looked up in surprise and asked him where he was the previous day. Jose didn't understand why she would ask this question, as he had been at the shop as normal, or so he thought, so he just gave a kind of an ambiguous answer and shrugged it off. Now, only later did he realize that the date was now August 22nd. He learned that after seeing the strange light, he had arrived home at 2 a.m. on August 22nd, not 4:30 or 5 a.m. on August 21st, as he assumed, as he should have arrived. So he discovered that he was actually missing some 22 hours of time that he could not account for. And that's where the matter sat for some time. But 2 years later, he was driving from Alicante to Benidorm when suddenly and spontaneously the memory of this event came rushing back to him right out of the blue. And as Jose says in his own words, and I quote, "At that moment, I tried to speed up my memory. Then I recalled a sight that will never be erased from my memory. I wanted to interpret the dazzling, powerful light on the little bridge of the Alicante General Highway as a huge derrick from which were suspended some cables, onto which were clinging some small men, between 1.5 and 1.6 meters in height. That's 4 feet 11 inches to 5 feet 3 inches. With a strong build, who were handling some tools. I remember that I greeted them, and they did not answer me. And the silence that reigned overcame me. I felt a tingling over my body, and now my mind fogged up. So that was all he could remember, just coming upon this light and seeing these strange men dangling from this sort of crane is how he described it. A very strange case. Such an unusual encounter. And as you'll see, there is a pattern here. The vast majority of these cases occur when people are perhaps outside. Quite a few do occur in people's bedrooms, but almost all of them occur at night. Not all of them, but what I would say the vast majority. It's a truly astonishing case, also in that he forgot about this whole incident for quite some time, or rather had spontaneous recall of what happened during at least some of this missing time, and was able to recall humanoids. So the vast majority of these cases, I think, do have humanoids, but whether people remember it or not is another matter. So let's move to the next case. This one is also pretty unusual. It's got some humorous elements to it. I don't know that the witness would feel that way, but as you'll see when we cover the case, you'll see what I mean. I call this one a sense of lightness. This one occurred on September 20, 1979 in Poplar Grove, Illinois. And this is another typical case of people driving on a highway late at night when they have their encounter. Yeah, it's a single witness case, but a really extraordinary example and pretty typical in a lot of ways of missing time. This case comes from the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, QFOS, and was investigated personally by J. Allen Hynek himself and researcher Alan Hendry. The witness is a young married mother. She is anonymous, so I'll call her Emily. On the pre-dawn hours of September 20, 1979, Emily left her home in Poplar Grove, Illinois, to travel to her job at a nursing home. This was a very rural route through cornfields and occasional homes. She hadn't driven very far when she saw an oval-shaped blue light surrounded by a white haze hovering stationary and low in the sky to the northwest. She watched it for about 15 seconds when suddenly this glowing object swooped towards her very swiftly and in perfect silence, descending closer and closer in a curving pattern right towards her and was soon right over her windshield. Immediately the object flooded her car with light. Frightened, she pressed the accelerator to the floor in an attempt to escape from the object, but weirdly, the car refused to accelerate and her speed remained a steady 40 miles per hour. At this point, Emily felt what she called, quote, a sense of lightness. She says it was almost as if she and the car were floating a few inches off the road. Then, suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, Emily found herself about 6 miles further down the road with no conscious recollection of how she got there. There was a parked police car nearby, so she stopped her car, got out, and ran to the police car for help. Now, meanwhile, her husband was at home listening to a police scanner, and this is when he overheard a report of a hysterical woman who was ranting to a police officer at the intersections of Beaverton and Poplar Grove roads. She was raving about a strange light in the sky, and he chuckled to himself until he suddenly realized that this ranting woman was actually his wife. Not long after the incident, Emily visited her family doctor, and as he was examining her eyes with a light probe, Emily had this sudden terrifying impression of glowing eyes staring down at her. In response, she involuntarily reached out and knocked the probe straight out of the doctor's hands. She could not offer any explanation as to why the doctor's probe had frightened her so badly. Now, after the encounter, she did take authorities to the location of the incident to show them where she had seen this strange light appear. And at that moment, as she was showing the officers, a plane flying by reflected the sunlight, making a bright flash in the sky. This caused her to become briefly hysterical with fear. It scared her really badly. And again, Emily could not explain her reaction. Researcher Alan Hendry did interview her doctor, who said that he had known Emily for 10 years and that she had a good marriage, a stable marriage, and had no history of panic attacks or anxiety. As in most cases, again, of missing time, what happened during this period of time that Emily was unable to account for remains a mystery. What's interesting to me about that case is that this lady said that she felt almost as if she and her car were floating off the ground. To me, that's a huge red flag that she was probably taken along with her car into the craft, because there are certainly a lot of examples of that. Also interesting is that she was found in a completely separate location. How does that happen? I mean, probably she was set back down. Again, I don't think that she sort of just lost consciousness and continued driving, because she would have ended up on the side of the road, probably in an accident. Another interesting thing were the after effects, where she felt sort of a panic attack as she was being physically examined by her doctor. This is a reaction that does happen to a number of contactees, and it's another way that they sort of have flashbacks or memories of the onboard experience. Again, hypnosis is a very effective method, in my humble opinion, if done correctly, to recover amnesia and missing time. But she declined to do it in this case. All right, let's move to the next case. This one got quite an uproar in the country where it occurred at the time. I call this one 7 hours of missing time. This occurred on July 31st, 1981 on Lake Pielinen in Finland. 7 hours, that's quite a bit of missing time. Usually missing time runs anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to an hour or two, but not unusual to have 4 or 5 or even 7 hours of missing time. Beyond that, that's quite rare. This is a multiple witness case, which adds to its credibility, certainly. Also, the witnesses had some undeniable physical effects following their encounter. But yeah, it's got some really interesting aspects to it. This case was investigated by Finnish researchers Juhani Kairolainen and Pekka Terakorpi. They are the authors of a Finnish language book titled UFO Mystery. Again, this case involves 2 witnesses, both friends, both anonymous men aged 35 years old. On July 31st, 1980, the 2 friends were on a holiday and were sailing their boat on Lake Pielinen. This is a big lake with 1,100 miles of shoreline. It's in fact Finland's 4th largest lake. Around 8:40 p.m., the men were heading south along the remote and rural forested coastline known as Varanimi Cape, heading towards the town of Liska. Without warning, an unusual, dark, almost cloud-like spherical object appeared overhead. They said this object had one large light and was surrounded by a group of much smaller lights. Now, no sooner had the men sighted this strange object when it began to approach them. Alarmed, they stopped the boat. The large light then left the sphere and approached their boat. Then a black object left the spherical object and flew to the stern of the boat, close enough for them to get a good look at it. They said it looked like a black craft with 2 lights surrounded by fog. Now, one of the men now found his body completely immobilized, though he was still able to speak to his friend. Then, what seemed like moments later, the black craft and the lights disappeared. The men were briefly disoriented and were now puzzled to find themselves sitting in different positions on the boat than they had been seconds earlier. They quickly checked their watches and were absolutely shocked to see that the time was now 4:10 a.m. So about 7 hours had passed in what seemed like seconds. Inexplicably, despite the fact that 7 hours were unaccounted for, and the fact that there was a strong current and winds, the boat was still in the same exact location. Now, in the days following this incident, both men experienced unusual symptoms, such as shaking hands, a poor sense of balance, and nightmares. These symptoms continued to persist for over a week, and realizing that they had just experienced a missing time UFO encounter, they did their research and contacted the Finnish researchers Juhani Kairalainen and Pekka Terakorpi. After interviewing the witnesses, the researchers decided to try regressive hypnosis to recover the 7 lost hours. However, their attempt failed, as did a second attempt. The witnesses were not able to recover anything. They never did learn what transpired during those 7 missing hours. These missing time cases raise so many questions. Where was the witnesses' boat when these guys were taken on board, or presumably taken on board? Was their boat taken with them? What happened during these 7 missing hours? Interesting that the hypnosis did not work with these two. That is not unusual. Sometimes people are simply not able to recover what happened during their missing time. Remember, Travis Walton was missing for 5 days, and he tried several times to do hypnosis and just couldn't get past the memory block. So I don't know. Something is happening during these missing hours. Now let's move to the next case. This one is so interesting to me because people will often say, if it's all right if I'm taken on board, I just wish the ETs would come to the front door, knock on the door, and ask. Well, in this case, there was an aspect to this where the UFOs did knock. In fact, I call this case When UFOs Knock. This one occurred one evening in February of 1983 in Grande Mere, Quebec, Canada, and some very, very unusual aspects to this particular case. This case comes from French journalist Michel Cloutier, and it first appeared in the February 4, 1983 issue of the French newspaper Le Nouvelliste in an article titled, "She Didn't Believe in Flying Saucers, but Then She Saw One." It was about 10:15 p.m. one evening in early February 1983 that Simone Lavergne went to bed in her home on 12th Street in the village of Grande Mere, Quebec, Canada. About 2 hours after falling asleep, she was awakened by a strong, hard knocking sound of unknown origin, which appeared to be coming from her home. The first time it happened, she just ignored it, but then it happened again. She felt no fear, only astonishment, and said to herself, "My God, what's going on?" So she got up, and thinking the refrigerator might be responsible for the unexplained knocking noises, she went into the kitchen, but the refrigerator was fine. A quick inspection of the living room and the basement also showed nothing unusual. In fact, the entire house was completely silent. So she went back to bed, and 5 minutes later, she heard that penetrating knocking sound again. And it now sounded to her like these knocking sounds were coming from the kitchen table. She was very puzzled and slightly worried and frightened. She got up, went to the kitchen, and inspected the table, but again, nothing was out of place. She decided to go to the sink and get a glass of water, and as she did so, she leaned forward and looked out the kitchen window and gasped with astonishment, because clearly visible was a flying saucer, sparkling with light. She said the object was egg-shaped, enormous, and in the center it had an array of almost jewel-like green lights, which were blinking on and off, as if rotating around an ellipse. She saw a sparkling white globe just beneath these lights, and 2 other glowing white orbs, one at each end of this object. And she exclaimed to herself, "My goodness, what's going on?" At this point, something even stranger happened. She became so riveted to the spot, just staring at the craft, that she completely lost track of time. She just leaned against the window looking, and in fact, it was about 1 hour later, now around 1:30 a.m., that she suddenly came to her senses, and she began to scream, saying, "Damn it, this doesn't make sense. I don't believe it. This doesn't make sense." Now at this point, she again heard 2 very strong knocks that now appeared to be coming from the faucet on the heating oil reserve tank outside the building. Now trembling with emotion, Simone watched the object for another half hour, when it started to spin slowly and then took off, becoming dimmer and disappearing into the distance. Now, interviewing Simone, journalist Michel Cloutier was struck by how entranced Simone was by the encounter. And as he writes, although completely unable to explain what happened to her in rational terms, Miss Simone Lavergne seems peacefully invaded by a sort of intoxication, as if under the effect of contact with some external source. In a declaration which was emotionally moving due to its great simplicity, she told us, "If they really are people from elsewhere who come to see us, I have a question to ask them. If their answer is positive, I shall have a personal revelation to make you." An interesting aftermath is that Simone's son, Jean Lavergne, who was a professional musician, was very much impressed by this sighting. So impressed, in fact, that he became an active UFO researcher, investigating dozens of cases, filming UFOs, forming his own UFO group, and eventually hosting his own radio program and appearing on TV, and was in fact awarded the first Prix Pauline Mongrain Award for the advancement of ufology in Quebec. How interesting is that? It's almost like the UFO is making these knocking noises to get this witness's attention, get her to look outside. The missing time aspect in this one isn't perfectly clear, but when someone says that they lost track of time and weren't sure how long this encounter lasted, that's a huge red flag. And apparently she was standing in front of her kitchen window for an hour. It's kind of hard to believe that you're just standing there staring, doing nothing. So perhaps that's when she was taken. Very interesting to me is that her son was so impressed by his mom's encounter that he himself became deeply involved in UFO research, forming his own UFO group, being heavily involved in UFO research to the point that he started his own podcast, went on TV, and so forth. So there's this interesting after effects to a lot of these encounters where people themselves help move forward the field of UFO research. Now let's move to the next case. This one has a really interesting takeaway, I think, as to why there is missing time. I call this one, They Want to Forget. This occurred on August 14, 1983 in Baltimore, Maryland. It's a double witness case, a mother and a daughter who had a very close-up encounter with a UFO, which apparently followed them home. This next case comes from APRO consultant Alfred Joseph Graziano and was published in the January 1984 issue of the APRO Bulletin. There are two witnesses, Pauline Drogelis and her 23-year-old daughter Cindy. It was around 10 p.m. on August 14, 1983. They had just started a road trip from Bath, Pennsylvania, and were returning to their home near Baltimore, Maryland. They did have to make a 20-minute side trip to drop off a passenger, but they knew that the entire journey should take them about 4 hours to complete. They were traveling southbound on Interstate 695 and were about 1 mile from home, and this is when they both noticed an odd-looking light in the sky. Because of its unusual appearance, they slowed down the car to observe it more clearly, and they could now see that it was in fact a round object, and it certainly did not appear to be a normal aircraft. They did notice another strange detail. As another car approached them and passed, the object moved away as if to avoid being spotted by the other car. After the other car was gone, the object returned. So they turned onto their street and lost sight of the object briefly, but when they arrived home and stopped in the driveway, they said, quote, something made them look up. And there, of course, was this object now hovering over the trees next to their house. Very nervous, they ran to their front porch and started banging on the front door and digging frantically in their purses to find their house keys, and the object started to move closer and hover stationary in a gap between the trees no more than 60 feet above the ground. And they could now clearly see that this was a craft, round with a dome on top, what looked to be slat-like windows around the dome. They estimated that this object was 30 feet wide. They could see lights at either end of it, and it was close enough that they could hear a very quiet, quote, whistling sound. So finally, Pauline's son opened the front door and they rushed inside. By this point, Pauline was frantic with fear. Weirdly, her daughter Cindy was completely calm, not the least bit excited or frightened. But the biggest shock was yet to come, because now, looking at the clock, they saw it was 4:10 a.m. This journey, which should have taken no more than 4 hours, had taken almost 6 hours. Deducting the time of the side trips and twice stopping for gas, they were still missing at least an hour of time. And there were a few other odd things. Both women were surprised by the unusually high consumption of gas, which seemed far more excessive than it should have been given the length of the trip. The other is an interesting physiological effect. As the investigator Joseph Graziano writes, and I quote, "One interesting fact has emerged in subsequent conversations. The witnesses said they both seem to sleep much better now than before the UFO encounter. They say that the slight cases of insomnia that they both had before are now completely gone, and they go to sleep with absolutely no trouble at all." Now, when it was discovered that the ladies had missing time and might not remember everything that had occurred during their trip, their reaction was not as positive. As the researcher Joseph Graziano writes, "Based on the credibility and lack of UFO knowledge of the witnesses, I feel certain that they did indeed have a close encounter with a UFO that night. In carefully reviewing the distances and time involved in their trip that evening, it also appears that there is still approximately 1 hour of time not accounted for. The witnesses say that they are not even thinking about what could have happened to this hour, and in fact they say they want to try and forget the experience completely." In many ways, that is a very typical encounter. People driving on a highway late at night, see a UFO, it begins to follow them, follows them all the way home. They rush inside. What's amazing to me is that this missing time was apparently seamless. So if they hadn't looked at the clock, they probably would not have known they even had missing time. Also interesting to me is that they both were cured, apparently, of insomnia. Because usually we see the opposite effect. People become anxious and have insomnia following the encounter. Not sure what's going on there. But the fact that both witnesses said that they wanted to forget the encounter, to me, that speaks towards why some people do have amnesia and missing time. Because they don't want to remember. I don't think the ETs intend to harm or scare people. And in fact, I've noticed a pattern that's very prominent. When someone has a lot of fear when they're taken on board, almost certainly they will have missing time. And those that react more calmly are much more prone to remember the events that take place. So I think that's another insight into the nature of missing time and why it occurs. Now let's move to the next case, which I call "We Didn't See Anybody." This one occurred one evening in January of 1988 in, of all places, Washington, D.C. It's hard to think of a less likely place for a UFO encounter, because let's face it, that's a pretty urbanized area. And this case did take place in a heavily populated suburban area. It's a multiple witness case. What I like about this case is it has a very unusual screen memory. All these cases are unusual, and this next case certainly is. It comes from researcher Bud Hopkins and was published in the September-October 1990 issue of the International UFO Journal, published by the Center of UFO Studies. The two witnesses are Carrie and Ann, those are pseudonyms, both college students at the American University at Washington, D.C. One evening in January 1988, they had attended a party in the suburbs, and around 2 a.m. they decided to head home. Now, to their horror, they soon came upon a 6-car accident, a massive pileup in the middle of an intersection. All the vehicles were badly smashed and tumbled together. But the odd part was, there was not a single person there. Not only that, there were no police, no ambulances, no paramedics, no traffic of any kind, and everything was eerily quiet. Everything about the situation seemed off. They both recalled slowing down slightly and then driving away without stopping. This also seemed strange to them and would not have been their normal reaction. As one of the witnesses, Carrie, said, "Someone might have been hurt, but we truly didn't see anybody in any of the cars." Anne, the other witness, said the whole scene seemed almost dreamlike. Now, Carrie had experienced unusual missing time encounters and UFO dreams as a young kid, and after experiencing this weird incident with the traffic accident, she wondered if it might be a screen memory, and she decided to contact Bud Hopkins. Bud eventually had both women placed under regressive hypnosis to see if this would provide any clarity. Now, under hypnosis, Carrie did recall coming upon this six-vehicle wreck. She recalled slowing down the car, and now she recalled stopping the car. This time she recalled several UFO occupants actually approaching the car. She was removed from the car while her friend Anne seemed to fall into a trance and just stare straight ahead. Once outside the car, Carrie could now see that what she had thought was a six-car pileup. Now she saw a landed UFO, and she was immediately taken on board. As Bud Hopkins says, after a typical examination, she was returned and told what she saw she will remember as a six-vehicle accident. She got back into the car next to a still staring Anne, started the motor, and drove off as her friend's normal animation returned. Now, Anne was also placed under hypnosis separately, and she too recalled coming upon the car accident and also coming to a stop. And this is when she seemed to pass out, and the next thing she recalled was looking back at this car accident through the rear view mirror. So essentially, their recall did match, though Carrie recalled many more details. Now, Bud Hopkins points this case out as an example of a screen memory, but unlike most cases which seem to involve a single witness, both witnesses experienced the same exact screen memory. As Bud writes, this Washington case establishes a major new corollary. Identical screen memories, plausible or outrageous, can be imposed with equal ease upon non-abductee witnesses to the same encounter. Now, Bud does state his belief that these screen memories are a way for the ETs to sort of cover their tracks, and in his article he points out other examples of how ETs use what he calls deceptive methods. This is the theme of his article, which he titled Abduction and Deception. He also stresses the need to study these accounts scientifically and objectively, and yet conversely, this article is filled with his personal opinions regarding the actions of the UFO occupants. But he does say this, and I quote, "We know that they do not seem to be either deliberately hurting us or deliberately helping us. They seem to be neither malevolent nor benign." Now, my personal opinion, I don't fully agree with this, because I can add that in my own research, there are quite literally hundreds of cases of ETs deliberately healing people and helping people. So I am a bit surprised to hear him writing this, especially as he himself told me to my face that there are many cases of healings. But to his credit in the article, he also writes, "In my 15 years of abduction research, I have not encountered a shred of evidence that suggests the UFO occupants are innately evil. Again, it is up to each of us to examine the evidence and the facts for ourselves and reach our own conclusions." There you go. Another typical case involving missing time. Really interesting to me that both women had the same screen memory, because as Bud Hopkins says, we rarely see this. So this could be an indication that the ETs are putting this forth. Bud Hopkins, in the article he wrote about this case, takes a pretty dim view of some of the ETs' actions. I don't fully agree with everything he says, but again, I'm just presenting the data as we know it. It's up to all of us to determine how we feel about what's going on here. But I found that one a pretty compelling case. There's a number of cases where one person seems to be the target and the other is put to sleep or put into a state of trance, perhaps. And we do see that in this case. But certainly a really excellent example of this whole missing time phenomena. And the lady did go under hypnosis. And of course, she did recall being taken on board. Now let's move to the last and final case in this collection, which I call, What the Hell Happened? This occurred one evening in June of 2013 in the small town of Kanab, Utah. It's a single witness case. His wife didn't wake up, unfortunately. But this case, I wanted to include it because the gentleman described, I think, very vividly and in great detail what it's like to have a bedroom visitation involving gray ETs and experiencing missing time with vague memories of being taken on board. This final case is quite brief, but I think an important case. It is an anonymous report from MUFON with a first-hand eyewitness testimony. I have given the main witness the pseudonym Wyatt. At the time of his encounter, he worked as a manager at the Kanab Custom Meats Company. One evening in June 2013, he and his wife had gone to bed as normal in their home in Kanab, Utah. At 3:05 p.m., he had awakened to go to the bathroom, and returning to bed and starting to fall asleep, he had the sudden realization that somebody else was in his bedroom. Now he was wondering for a second if he was dreaming when he lifted up his head and he could now see 2 or 3, quote, small people standing at the foot of the bed and one right next to him looking at him. And as Wyatt says, they had control of my mind. I was not afraid. I felt like I had experienced this before. I at first wondered how they got into the house, and when I wondered that, they communicated telepathically that opening doors was nothing. And almost simultaneously, I was elevated and going with them. I could not cry out and wondered why my wife was sleeping through all of this. She is a light sleeper. Then it occurred to me that they were doing everything telepathically anyway and not making a sound. This is where my memory stops. I don't know if I physically went on a ship with them or not. I do remember the wind on my face and being put back into bed. I looked at the clock and it was 4:22. I went to sleep. End of story. So you can see that Wyatt was missing about 1 hour and 15 minutes, and he was never able to recall what happened during this missing time. However, the experience did prompt another memory of something similar happening some 16 years earlier in 1997. He was driving a truck for Kanab Meats down a remote Utah road at night when he came upon a bright light in the road, and he couldn't remember anything other than this. But as Wyatt says, I got home an hour later than normal, and I wondered what the hell had happened. I remember just a glimpse, like being lifted up and such, and once again, wind in my face. Following this incident, he did notice a strange red blemish on the back of his hand that hadn't been there prior to this encounter, and years later, it's still there and remains tender to the touch. And while these are the only 2 accounts of missing time that he can consciously recall, he says, and I quote, I feel like this has happened several times since 1997. Again, in most respects, I think that is a typical case of a bedroom visitation, gray ETs, missing time. There is physiological effects, of course. Interesting to me is that this event sparked earlier memories of other missing time encounters, and that he feels that this has happened to him on numerous occasions, which is certainly the pattern we see with most contactees. It's very rarely a one-off. But there you go, 11 cases involving missing time, amnesia associated with a UFO encounter. Still lots of questions surrounding exactly why this happens, who's responsible for it. I think, honestly, this is my opinion, it's a bit of a two-way street. I think we ourselves are responsible for remembering what happens to us. But when someone chooses not to remember, I think the ETs will facilitate that because, again, it's not their intention to leave anyone traumatized or scared or anything like this. And often we see that in some cases involving missing time, the ETs will tell people things like, you will remember when it's time, or actually the memory will come back spontaneously in the days, weeks, months, or even years following the encounter. So it's not like the memories are being erased. They're there within the person's mind. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. 11 cases that I'm guessing you haven't heard before. Love finding those obscure cases. So thank you guys. I truly appreciate you watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I'll see you next time for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Signing off.